Welcome, friends, to another quiet journey through the distant past. Tonight, we slip into the warm, misty world of ancient Rome, not through its battles or politics, but through the tiled chambers of a Roman bathhouse. A place of steam, sweat, ritual and silence, where emperors and laborers once shared the same water, beneath vaulted ceilings and flickering torchlight. Now, dim your lights, close your eyes, let your breath slow and allow yourself to drift into a world of stone pools, marble benches, and ancient echoes. And if you enjoy stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps us bring you more sleepy journeys into the quiet corners of history. The sun had begun its slow descent over the rooftops of Rome, casting elongated shadows across the worn cobblestones, and warming the ochre-coloured walls with a soft golden hue that clung to the edges of each building like ancient dust. The sounds of the city were quieter now, as if the afternoon itself had grown tired. The clamour of the forum was beginning to fade behind, replaced by the more subdued rhythms of neighbourhoods tucked between sloping hills and winding alleyways. Merchants still called out their final bargains, voices softer than they had been at noon, and the smell of fresh bread mingled faintly with the sharp scent of olives from nearby stalls. A pair of oxen passed slowly, their wooden yoke creaking softly under the weight of a cart that no longer bore its morning load, while children, their games now less frantic, traced chalk lines along the edge of a fountain that had long since seen its share of imperial coin offerings. Along one of these calmer lanes, the stones underfoot began to grow more even, smoother, flatter, as if years of traffic, not from wagons but from sandals, had worn them down into an almost polished state. The noise of the city, so textured and constant, began to take on a different tone, not disappearing but shifting, melting into a quieter ambience where footsteps echoed longer and the air seemed to hold its breath. One could sense they were approaching something important, something not just architectural, but almost sacred in its own way, a place where the rhythms of life slowed, where time bent slightly at the edges. Ahead, the stone arches of the bathhouse rose with a kind of quiet majesty, not ostentatious, not gilded or overly adorned, but weighty and deliberate, as if the building itself had always existed there, carved from time rather than stone. It stood like a temple, but not one dedicated to the gods of Olympus. Rather, it was devoted to the gods of warmth, of water, of human stillness and restoration. The facade was wide and symmetrical, with high columns on either side of a central entrance that remained open, its great bronze doors fastened back during daylight hours so that the bathhouse could breathe. From within came no music or chanting, no thunder of voices, but instead a kind of murmuring calm, a chorus of echoing footsteps on marble floors, of water moving through channels and pools, and the occasional distant laugh that sounded oddly reverent in its restraint. As one stepped closer, there was a change in the air, subtle at first, then undeniable. The sense of the city began to fade, replaced by something warmer, heavier. The sharp tang of heating oil, the earthy scent of stone soaked in moisture, the faint metallic trace of bronze piping, all mingled with the unmistakable human presence that lingered in these spaces. It was the scent of sandalwood oil rubbed into skin, of dried sweat clinging to linen towels, of damp leather sandals left near the door, and of age-old steam rising through thin shafts from the heated floors deep within. Even the air itself felt different here, not quite humid, but infused with a thickness that promised comfort. The building was alive, not just with people, but with systems, invisible furnaces burning quietly beneath the floor, water flowing along carefully constructed channels, air rising and falling like breath inside a chest of stone. To the left of the entrance stood a small fountain, its basin decorated with faded mosaics of sea creatures long eroded by time and water. A few older men sat near it, their tunics simple, their conversation nearly silent, each of them holding the stillness of those who had already completed their ritual. Nearby, a younger man handed off his sandals to a boy, likely a slave, who hurried inside, disappearing quickly behind a heavy curtain that fluttered as he passed through. Everything here moved with a certain weightlessness, a deliberate pace that suggested there was no rush, no urgency. This was not a place to be hurried. This was a place where time unraveled slowly, like steam rising from stone. In the distance, a bell sounded from a nearby temple, marking the hour, not precisely, but as a gentle reminder that the day was drifting toward its later hours. The light continued to soften, and the shadows now stretched long across the entranceway, making the carved stone above the door seem deeper, more mysterious. One could just make out the inscription, partly worn, Balnea sunt vitae, partis non minimi, baths are no small part of life. And indeed, for many Romans, this was not merely a luxury, not simply a place to clean the body, but a necessary ritual woven into the fabric of existence itself. It was here that the body was soothed, the mind quieted, and the spirit, if not elevated, at least momentarily unburdened. A small group of men approached, speaking softly, their footsteps barely registering as they ascended the shallow stone steps. They did not look at the building as one might admire a monument. They did not pause in awe. They had come here many times before, and likely would again. The bathhouse was as much a part of their daily lives as the marketplace or the forum, and its familiarity did not dull its importance. There was something sacred in repetition, in returning to the same place each day to be reminded of one's homenness, of the need for water, for warmth, for contact, for silence. In a world of expansion and conquest, of emperors and spectacle, here was a world that asked nothing more than that one enter, breathe, and be still. And so, as the city's pulse slowed into the dusk, and as the warm breath of the bathhouse drifted outward through its tall entrance like incense from an altar, the visitors stepped quietly into the shadows beyond. The flickering torches along the hallway cast rippling patterns against the marble walls, and the sounds of the outside world faded completely behind them, replaced by the hush of moving water and distant, muffled voice. Their sandals echoed gently as they crossed the threshold, and as the light shifted and the air grew thicker with heat and memory, the outer city fell away entirely, giving itself over to the first true chamber of transformation. The moment one crossed the boundary between the outside world and the bathhouse proper, the city vanished behind, like a forgotten memory. Its noise and dust dissolved into the soft hush of murmured voices, and the liquid, ever-present sound of water in motion. The tall bronze doors, once passed, gave way to a space neither dark nor bright, but something suspended in between, a twilight of stone and echo, where light filtered in not directly, but through high, narrow windows set into the thick outer walls. These shafts of sunlight caught on drifting steam and dust particles, making the air itself seem alive, glimmering faintly with golden motes that danced and spun without destination, as if time had thinned and slowed inside the walls. The scent was the first true marker of transition. Outside had smelled of heat, of animals, of dry earth and sun-warmed brick, but here the air was thick with heat of a different kind. The dry, mineral-rich scent of heated tile mingled with olive oil, damp linen, and something faintly metallic, like water that had passed through bronze pipes and ancient stone. There was no breeze, and yet the air moved, rolling gently, stirred by footsteps, and the occasional drift of steam from deeper rooms. It clung to the skin like a second robe, heavier than fabric, but not unpleasant, like the weight of blankets after a long day, familiar and strangely comforting. The voices that filled the chamber were soft and low, not hushed out of reverence, but simply because the acoustics of the space demanded it. Even the smallest sound, the scuff of a sandal, the splash of a foot in shallow water, the rustle of linen being folded, echoed upward toward the vaulted ceiling and returned as a whisper. Conversations were held close to the body, heads inclined toward one another, hands making subtle gestures that meant more than the words themselves. No one shouted here, no one ran. The bathhouse reshaped its visitors, quieting the loud and slowing the hurried, not through force but through its overwhelming calm, its architectural insistence on stillness. The space just beyond the entrance was not yet the bathing area, but a kind of threshold, a place to adjust, to remove the mental garments of the outside world, just as the physical ones would soon be set aside. It was here that one first noticed the walls, tiled in alternating bands of soft cream and earthen red, carefully fitted and polished so that they gleamed with moisture, despite the absence of running water upon them. Niches in the walls held statues, many of them worn and chipped, their features softened by years of heat and steam, but still recognizable. Apollo with his lyre, Venus with her mirror, Hercules mid-stride with his club across his back. They stood watch not like deities demanding worship, but like old companions observing a familiar routine, their marble eyes following the flow of visitors with neither judgment nor approval. Beneath these silent figures, people moved with purpose, but not. An older man, his back slightly bent, made his way slowly toward a side chamber. A young boy, perhaps his grandson or his slave, trailing behind, carrying a folded cloth and a small jar of oil. A group of men in their 30s clustered near a basin, speaking quietly, their expressions serene, interrupted occasionally by brief smiles or nods. They wore loose tunics, soon to be discarded, and their sandals had already been removed, stacked neatly near a bench against the wall. Nearby a woman passed through, head covered, escorted by 2 attendants. Her presence suggested this bathhouse either allowed separate hours for women, or included a side reserved for them entirely. She did not speak, but her movements were as practiced and certain as any of the men. There were attendants here as well, though they moved almost invisibly, slaves and freedmen, recognized more by their absence than their presence. They worked with practiced efficiency, collecting towels, guiding newcomers, sweeping the stone floor with long-handled brushes that stirred up small clouds of moisture and heat. Their eyes remained low, their footsteps soft, their presence as woven into the place as the tiles beneath their feet. From somewhere deeper within the building came a change in temperature, a slow rolling wave of warmth that was not heat exactly, but promise, the promise of rooms filled with steam and pools heated from below, of stone benches, slick with condensation, and of voices softened further into murmurs by the embrace of water. One could not yet see these chambers, but their presence was palpable, pressing gently against the skin like rising humidity before a storm. The sounds from those rooms filtered outward, the faint splash of immersion, the ring of dripping water striking stone, and a low, almost musical resonance as air moved through the pipes of the hypocaust system beneath the floor. The building breathed, and those inside adjusted their own rhythms to match. A long corridor stretched ahead, its walls lit by evenly spaced torches whose flames flickered in the stillness. The path was lined with benches, small alcoves for storage, and cubbyholes built into the stone, places where visitors would soon store their garments and sandals, surrendering the last symbols of their outside selves. It was in this moment, standing at the edge of disrobing, that the visitor truly began to feel the transformation, not just of body but of mind. The bathhouse did not simply clean, it erased the dust of the city, the worries of the market, the tensions of the home, all of it faded beneath the rising weight of heat, silence and ritual. The hallway led onward, the shadows from the torches dancing across the tiled floor like ghosts of footsteps long past. Each step taken now brought with it a shedding of burdens, physical, emotional, even temporal. Here there were no clocks, no ledgers, no imperial decrees, only water, and warmth, and weight. And at the end of this corridor where the light grew a little warmer, and the voices a little quieter, the room began to open. A large echoing chamber where the rituals of transition began in earnest. It was here that one would undress, not in shame but in preparation, for what came next required no layers, no ornament, no pretense, only the bare self, and the ancient rituals of cleansing that had remained unchanged for generations. At the end of the long corridor, the space widened into a chamber both austere and alive, its walls broad and smooth, its ceilings high and echoing. This was the hypocausts, the changing room, though to reduce it to so simple a description would be to strip away the layers of purpose it held. It was not merely a place where clothes were removed, but the first act of immersion, the symbolic release of identity and status. Within this chamber, the garments worn on the streets of Rome, tunics of linen or wool, belts of bronze, sandals rubbed smooth by years of city walking, were folded and set aside, placed not just into niches of stone or wood, but into a suspended space where the outside world no longer followed. The moment one stepped into this room, The atmosphere changed yet again. The warmth was deeper here. Not the gentle diffusion of heated air, but the humidity of human presence and ancient routine. The scent was heavier with oils, with the musk of perspiration long soaked into porous walls, and with the faintest trace of perfumed unguents used by the wealthier patrons. The floor, a mosaic of blue and green tesserae arranged in undulating patterns like waves, was slick with moisture, not wet exactly, but filmed with the evidence of many feet passing over it in slow procession. Lining the walls were rows of recessed compartments, small alcoves carved into the stone where sandals and tunics could be stored. Some were bare, waiting to be filled. Others already held the modest bundles of early arrivals. Wealthier visitors brought slaves or freedmen to mind their belongings, for theft, though rare, was not unknown. A pair of guards, not soldiers, but large men in simple garb, stood near one wall, watching but not interfering. Their presence was deterrent enough. Men of all ages occupied the room, each at a different stage of undress, each participating in the quiet ritual with practiced ease. An older patrician sat on a bench near one corner, his toga already folded and handed off to a silent servant, who stood with eyes downcast, holding a small cloth bag filled with scented oil and a polished bronze strigil. Near him a pair of younger men, likely merchants or the sons of lesser nobles, spoke in low voices about recent games in the Colosseum, their hands gesturing absently as they stepped out of their tunics and folded them neatly. One of them laughed at something the other said, and the sound echoed, brief and soft, across the tiled chamber like the call of a distant bird. Not far away, a more modest figure, a freedman by his worn tunic and simple sandals, undressed alone, folding his clothing with the same care as the others, but without an attendant to assist him. His face was neutral, but his eyes darted now and then toward the nobleman, not out of envy, but out of the old habit of watching those who once might have owned him. Here in this space they were closer to equals than the street outside would ever allow. Nudity in this setting was not humiliation, but democracy. Skin rendered each man similar, each muscle or scar visible beneath the soft light and rising warmth. A few children darted between the columns, accompanied by nurses or house slaves, their laughter lighter, freer than the older men's hushed speech. One paused to inspect a mosaic fish embedded in the floor, while another tried and failed to balance on one foot. The elder slaves used to such antics intervened gently, redirecting the energy without words, returning the boys to their fathers with a firm hand and a silent glance. Even discipline here was subdued. Slaves moved quietly throughout the chamber, retrieving garments and sandals, assisting with disrobing, offering soft cloths and pouring warm water from amphorae for washing away the first layer of dust and sweat. Some carried oil jars, uncorked and ready, their contents fragrant and gold. Others bore stacks of linen, folded and warm from their place near the caldarium wall to be used later in drying or wrapping. It was not uncommon for discussions to arise here, political musings, the latest Senate decisions, rumors of uprisings in distant provinces, or the cost of grain in Ostia. One man, balding and thick-set, spoke quietly about a magistrate who had been caught in a scandal involving temple funds, while another recounted a vivid dream he'd had about Mars, the god of war, which he believed was an omen of upcoming conflict in the north. These stories drifted in the steam like incense, absorbed by the air, unrecorded but strangely permanent in the minds of those who heard them. Yet beneath all this, the murmurs, the shuffling feet, the slick stone, was something even quieter, the sensation of transformation. As the tunics were folded and the bodies revealed, so too were the unspoken weights people carried. Shoulders relaxed, brows unknitted, and breath slowed. The act of disrobing was not just physical but psychological, a divestment of the expectations and performances worn each day in the city. Here a senator and a baker might sit side by side on the same bench, their bodies indistinguishable in the half-light, their worries softened by warmth. Above them, small apertures in the ceiling allowed thin beams of sunlight to cut through the rising mist, striking shoulders and backs, catching in the droplets that clung to skin. From a distance the room appeared as a kind of living sculpture garden, bodies in repose, in motion, bent in ritual, all glowing faintly in the steam-filtered light. And when all was ready, when the clothes had been stored, when the oil was applied and the outer world fully set aside, the visitor stepped forward again, this time not toward more stone or chambered air, but toward open sky. For the next phase of the journey did not plunge deeper into the building's interior, but instead turned outward into the warmth of an open courtyard beyond. There, in a space both public and serene, the body would be tested and prepared for the heat to come. Muscles would be stretched, limbs loosened, and the rituals of movement begun. Because before one could submit to the calming embrace of steam and water, the body had to be awakened, not by heat, but by effort. And the courtyard of the palestra, bathed in sunlight and framed by marble, waited silently for those ready to engage with their own strength once more. The doorway to the palestra opened like a slow sigh, revealing not another cloistered chamber of tile and mist, but an entirely different world, bright, sun-warmed, and alive with motion. Stepping out from the apoditerium, the contrast was immediate and all-consuming. Where the changing room was enclosed and subdued, the palestra was open to the sky, bordered by colonnades of white marble that shimmered faintly in the mid-morning light. The air was no longer thick with steam, but crisp and tinged with the scent of warm dust, trampled herbs, and sun-heated stone. Birds circled high above in lazy arcs, their calls distant and unconcerned with the human endeavors below. The courtyard was a wide expanse of packed earth and gravel, bordered on all sides by covered walkways where spectators, tutors, and idlers lingered in the shade, watching the morning's exertions unfold. Beneath the columns, stone benches held slaves who waited patiently for their masters, and trainers who shouted encouragement or correction in equal measure. In one corner, an elderly philosopher with a beard like drifted snow sat with a stylus in hand, scratching notes onto a wax tablet, as he murmured observations on posture, balance, or perhaps the metaphysics of movement itself. Here, even physicality was a subject of study. At the center of this wide arena, bodies moved, slowly, rhythmically, with the purposeful tension of men reacquainting themselves with the demands of their own muscles. Some stretched with arms extended to the sky, joints popping faintly as they twisted and leaned. Others engaged in gentle combat, grappling shoulder to shoulder, their legs braced in the dust, the strain in their thighs like the chords of a drawn bow. A group near the far wall passed a small leather ball between them, their movements fluid and quick, the game a ritual as old as the bathhouse itself. And through all of this, there was the gleam of oil, not sweat alone, but olive oil, generously poured and rubbed into the skin with practiced hands. Slaves moved among the athletes with small jars and flat bronze spatulas, assisting in the application of the viscous liquid that softened the body and made it shine like bronze in the light. It was not simply for appearance, though the effect was striking. The oil allowed the skin to move freely, protected it from the elements, and prepared it for the coming scrapes of the strigil and the heat of the steam room. The scene was not one of chaos but of controlled energy, a dance choreographed by centuries of habit. A boy of perhaps 14 sparred with an older man under the watchful eye of a trainer, his arms thin but quick, his breath short but steady. Across from them a senator known for his vanity strained against a thick-set merchant in a wrestling hold, each man gritting his teeth as their feet carved furrows into the ground. Neither would admit fatigue, though both panted beneath their controlled expression. Yet the palestra was not solely for the strong or ambitious. In one quiet corner near the garden wall, a middle-aged man with a slight limp practiced slow, deliberate stretches beneath the guidance of a quiet slave, his movements marked by restraint rather than force. His body, though not youthful, carried the grace of someone who understood its limitations and honored them. This too was part of the ritual, not to conquer the body, but to listen to it, to meet it where it was, and coax it gently toward vitality. The sounds of the palestra mingled into a soft, persistent hum, the thud of feet on earth, the slap of skin against skin in grapples, the grunted breath of exertion, the clipped words of instruction. Overhead the sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows beneath the colonnades, while pigeons cooed from the roof tiles, and the occasional fig dropped with a soft pat into the garden beds beyond the wall. Along the northern edge of the courtyard stood a fountain, not large but elegant, its basin carved in the shape of a seashell, with water bubbling softly from the mouth of a dolphin carved in worn marble. Some paused here to rinse their faces or drink, cupping their hands and letting the cool liquid trail down their arms and chests. The contrast between the sun's heat and the water's chill was momentary but bracing, sharpening the senses before the final effort. Oil mixed with dust on the skin, creating a thin sheen of golden mud that would later be scraped away in the next room, but for now it clung to limbs like armor. This layer was not unclean, it was evidence of participation, of intent. To pass through the palastra was to commit fully to the bathing process, to ready oneself not merely for cleansing but for renewal. No one was rushed. The time spent here varied. Some men lingered for half an hour, working every joint and tendon, testing their balance and speed. Others, less interested in exertion, performed a perfunctory stretch or two before retreating to the shade. A few, intoxicated by the heat and movement, remained for the better part of an hour, sweat glistening on their brows as they pushed through exercises learned in youth and repeated every week since. And always, the presence of the bathhouse loomed gently beyond the courtyard, its domes and archways visible through the colonnades, promising warmth and release. The knowledge of what awaited lent a calm rhythm to the efforts here. The fatigue gathered in the palastra would be soothed in the frigidarium. The tightness of shoulders and backs eased beneath jets of warm water and clouds of scented steam. As the sun crested and cast its full light across the courtyard, more and more figures began to drift toward the doorway that led inward once again, not to the entrance, but deeper into the core of the bathhouse. Their movements slowed as they passed from dust and sun into shadow and stir. Slaves followed, carrying flasks of oil and baskets of cloth, some pausing to refill amphorae at the fountain before continuing on. The body had been primed, stretched, flexed and bathed in the oil of olives harvested from distant estates. Breath had deepened, the heart had stirred, and the muscles, once stiff from sleep or sedentary labor, now hummed with quiet readiness. This then was the final act before surrender, the moment when exertion gave way to stillness. And as the visitors stepped through the archway leading to the frigidarium, where gentle warmth awaited to cradle the flesh and calm the pulse, they left behind the brightness of the courtyard for the dim, fragrant quiet of stone once more, a space where the body awakened by effort would now begin its journey into warmth and water, and the slow, sacred process of purification would truly begin. By now, the skin was damp with exertion and sun, the limbs warmed from movement in the palastra, and the pores open, beckoning release. It was here, in this delicate space between effort and relaxation, that one of the most quintessentially Roman rituals unfolded. There was no soap, no frothy bubbles or fragrant lather. Instead, cleanliness was a careful art, slow, deliberate, and deeply tactile. A servant approached, bearing a slender bronze flask filled with olive oil, perhaps infused with herbs, or left plain, depending on one's station. The oil, warmed slightly by the sun or the ambient heat of the bathhouse, was poured into the palm, then spread in long, smooth motions across the bather's arms, shoulders, chest, and back. It clung to the skin, glistening softly in the hazy light that filtered in from above, collecting dust, sweat, and the residue of the day, like a living second skin. Then came the strigil, a curved blade of metal, often made from bronze or iron, cool to the touch and worn smooth from use. Its edges were not sharp in the way of knives but firm and purposeful. With it, the oil was scraped away in long, curling motions, dragging with it the impurities of the skin, dirt, dead cells, and the stories of the day. The sound it made was barely audible, a faint drag and pull, like parchment being turned, but the sensation was vivid, a tug at the surface, a release of tension, a slow unpeeling of the self. For some, it was a solitary act, performed with mechanical precision. For others, it was a shared ritual. Wealthier patrons might lie on a bench while a servant, trained in the motions, worked silently over their bodies, ensuring no crease or joint was missed. Friends might assist one another, laughing quietly between strokes of the blade. And sometimes, especially among the young or beautiful. The ritual took on a more sensual rhythm, an intimacy born not of passion, but of shared flesh and the comfortable anonymity of the bathhouse. The scent of oil mingled with the ever-present moisture in the air, creating an aroma that was earthy, human and strangely comforting. It was not perfume nor incense. It was the smell of the Roman body, tended and honored in its own quiet way. In this space, time seemed to slow. The noise from the palastra drifted into the distance, muffled by the thick walls and heavy air. Conversations lowered to murmurs, the scraping of strigils forming a rhythmic counterpoint to the steady trickle of water from nearby fountains. Here, nakedness was not a spectacle but a norm, unremarkable and unremarked. Bodies of all kinds, bearing scars of work or battle, marks of age or youth, stood side by side in this communal pursuit of cleanliness. And it was more than physical. To scrape the body clean was to shed the outside world, to leave behind the dust of the forum, the tension of politics, the noise of the streets. It was a small rebirth, repeated daily, that prepared the bather for the next phase, the gradual immersion into warmth, silence, and surrender. As the last of the oil was removed, the strigil wiped clean, and the body lightly patted down with a cloth, the transition began. Muscles, no longer tight from exertion, now ached gently for something softer, for heat, for stillness, for the enveloping embrace of water. And so, with footsteps softened by worn soles, the bather would drift from the palastra past the pillars and mosaics, toward the dimmer chambers beyond, where heat pulsed gently from beneath the floor, and the air grew thicker with mist. The tepidarium awaited, the warm room that served as the gateway to deeper relaxation. And as the doorway to that next chamber grew nearer, so too did the hush that accompanied it. The soft lull of conversation, the slow rustle of movement, the gentle invitation of steam curling lazily into the corridor, all called the visitor on. With the oil scraped clean and the strigil wiped of its burdens, the bather moved forward, barefoot and unhurried, the air shifting perceptibly with each step. The soft echo of soles brushing smooth stone followed him down the passage, growing quieter as he left behind the pale light of the palastra and entered the half-lit threshold of the inner sanctum. Before him, a wide arch opened into the tepidarium, the warm room, and almost at once he could feel the change. The air thickened gently, a subtle embrace that clung to the skin, not with dampness, but with a slow, spreading heat, neither startling nor still. It was not the kind of warmth that demanded attention, but one that settled into the body with calm authority, dissolving the edge from every muscle and replacing it with something soft and pliable. The floor beneath his feet, heated from below by the hypocausts system, a marvel of Roman engineering, released its warmth in slow waves, as if the stones themselves were exhaling. The walls, polished marble, veined with fading golds and reds, held the memory of that warmth and radiated it back with a quiet steadiness, as if the room were alive, breathing heat into every corner. Around him, others reclined on low benches or stood in quiet groups, their forms softened by the faint mist that hovered in the air like a veil between the world and the dream. Murmured voices echoed gently in the chamber, not the sharp conversations of the forum or the teasing banter of the palastra, but something lower, slower, like voices remembered from a fading dream. The acoustics of the room gave everything a liquid quality. Words stretched and curled, drifting across the space and mingling with the occasional splash of a ladle into a basin, or the soft rustle of cloth being adjusted. Above, the windows were high and narrow, designed to let in light without disrupting the hush. Beams of sunlight filtered down like golden mist, catching on the haze and turning it into something holy. Time in the tepidarium did not pass in moments, but in breaths, long, slow inhalations of warm, fragrant air, tinged faintly with the scent of herbs, oils, and centuries of youth. A servant passed, carrying a shallow bowl of cool water, offering it with a bow to a reclining man whose limbs were half draped over a cushioned bench. The man nodded, but did not speak, and the servant placed the bowl beside him without a sound. Elsewhere, a mother poured water gently over her child's back, her touch gentle, almost ceremonial. The child giggled, but even that sound was muted, absorbed by the marble, the mist, the reverent atmosphere of the space. This was not a place for action or speech. This was a threshold, not only between rooms, but between states of being. To linger in the tepidarium was to prepare oneself for surrender. The heat of the body was drawn inward, smoothed and softened, and made ready for what came next. Here, the bather was neither in the realm of the physical, nor fully within the steam-soaked chambers beyond. It was a liminal space, the pause before the plunge. Thoughts too seemed to dissolve in the warmth. Worries from the street or the Senate or the marketplace faded, slipping away like mist on the surface of a mirror. Eyes closed without effort, shoulders lowered, breaths deepened. Some fell into a kind of half-sleep, lulled by the ambient heat and the stillness of the air. Others, more contemplative, gazed at the intricate mosaics on the walls and floors, patterns of dolphins and sea nymphs, of waves and vines, their minds drifting gently among the images. The tepidarium did not demand attention, it merely offered space, a rare and precious gift in a city that so often pulsed with motion and noise. For the body, the room was a balm. The pores opened earlier with sweat and oil, welcomed the warmth. Blood moved more freely. The ache of labor or training slipped quietly into the background. There were no sudden temperatures, no jolts, only the careful ushering of the body further along the path to complete release. The room worked its purpose without needing announcement. It was felt, not known, and so those who entered rarely left quickly. They stayed as long as they needed, or as long as their thoughts required, until the rhythm of their breath matched the rhythm of the space. Eventually, without signal or speech, the bather would rise, his limbs now looser, his skin flushed with warmth, the muscles no longer coiled but liquid. He would move slowly toward the next arch, where the air shimmered faintly with rising heat. Beyond that threshold lay the caldarium, the hot room, where steam thickened the air like a fog, and silence deepened. The passage between them was short but significant. He stepped forward not with reluctance, but with the quiet anticipation of one who is ready to shed even more of the world, and of the self. Even as the heat deepened, and the breath of steam beckoned from the caldarium beyond, it was impossible not to pause, to turn the eyes not inward but outward, and drink in the splendor that adorned every inch of the bathhouse. For this place, though devoted to bodily cleansing and social gathering, was in truth no less a temple to art and the divine than the great basilicas or temples of the Forum. It was not enough in the Roman mind for a space to be useful. It must also be beautiful. Every step through the bathhouse brought the bather into intimate contact with the stories of the empire, not merely told in voice or scroll, but embedded into the very floors beneath their feet and the walls that surrounded them, rising in marble and color and myth. The ground itself was a canvas, meticulously laid in tesserae, those tiny multicolored cubes of stone, glass, or ceramic, arranged with a patience that spoke not just of wealth, but of reverence. The mosaics depicted sea creatures, dolphins leaping through curling waves, fish with golden scales flickering as if mid-motion, nereids riding on the backs of hippocamps. These images did not merely decorate the floor, they transformed it. With every step, the bather walked upon a painted ocean, a mythic sea summoned forth from the imagination of artisans who had never seen its depths but knew it by story and tradition. There, in another chamber, the eye was drawn to scenes of athletes in motion, discus throwers with muscles captured mid-turn, wrestlers locked in elegant struggle, runners caught forever just before the foot touched earth. They were not merely pictures, they were tributes to the human form, to the Roman ideal of strength, harmony and grace. The details were astonishing, the curl of a foot, the tension in a thigh, the determined set of a jaw. These were not anonymous figures, but living beings, caught in an eternal loop of glory and exertion, watched now by bathers who strolled past them in silence, perhaps seeing in them a version of themselves, or what they hoped to be. Along the curved walls of the caldarium, where the steam licked the stone and shadows danced upon wet marble, stood statues of the gods themselves, presiding silently over the rituals below. Apollo with his lyre serene and aloof, his marble eyes staring endlessly through the haze. Venus, all curves and poise, her form softened further by the moist air, seemed less stone than flesh made still. Hercules, rugged and muscular, leaned upon his club, a lion's skin draped over one shoulder, eternal guardian of masculine strength and endurance. These statues were not placed carelessly, nor were they merely ornamental. They were symbols, reminders of the divine order that structured the Roman world, where beauty, power, and myth were interwoven with daily life. To bathe beneath the gaze of such figures was not a profane act, but a sacred one. The gods themselves had bathed according to the myths. They had washed in springs and rivers, been attended by nymphs, and adorned their bodies with oils and perfume. In recreating those scenes here, the Romans brought the realm of Olympus into the heart of their city, making the divine accessible through routine and architecture. Even the ceilings reached skyward with ambition, arched and coffered, painted with scenes of the heavens, of soaring birds, floating deities, and stars that shimmered faintly in the flickering light of oil lamps. The roofs of the bathhouse drew the eye upward, as if to suggest that the soul too might rise, unburdened alongside the body. The columns too were not merely structural, carved from imported marbles, green from Greece, red from Egypt, pure white from the Italian quarries. They spiraled upward, like trees in an enchanted forest, each one different, each one whispering of distant lands and conquests, of wealth and reach and unity under Rome's rule. Between them, alcoves and niches held smaller works, busts of emperors past, the stone faces worn smooth by time and steam, yet still recognizable, laurel wreaths etched upon brows, stern lips pressed into eternal silence. In one corner a small shrine flickered, a votive flame guarded in brass, where some bathers paused, hands lifted in silent gesture, to honor their household gods, or perhaps ask for strength, for clarity, for healing. It was easy in such surroundings to believe that the line between mortal and divine could be blurred, softened by steam and shadow. The decor was not merely background, it was narrative. Every wall told a story, every image carried meaning. The bathhouse was a place of cleansing, yes, but also of education. Young boys led by tutors might pause before a mosaic of Neptune rising from the sea, and hear the tale of how the god struck the earth with his trident to release the first horde. A father might lift his son and point toward a frieze, showing Romulus and Remus suckled by the she-wolf, murmuring the origin of the city they both belonged to. These were not lifeless decorations, they were memory, culture, and myth embedded in stone. They reminded the bather who he was, where he came from, and what the empire represented: power, beauty, order. Even the benches were carved with care, their legs shaped like lions' paws, their edges inlaid with bronze. The fountains too were adorned, spouts shaped like dolphin mouths, water cascading from urns held aloft by statues of fauns and satyrs. The sound of water, ever present, was not a mere utility, but part of the aesthetic, the rhythm of the place, a kind of music made by the building itself. It soothed, it cleansed, it celebrated. In such a space the outside world seemed to disappear. The dusty streets, the calls of vendors, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, all faded into unreality. Here, within walls adorned by gods and myths, the Roman citizen was transported, not away from reality, but deeper into the Roman idea of it, where the physical and the ideal, the worldly and the divine, coexisted in perfect marble balance. And so the bather lingered, not just to bask in the warmth, or prepare for the next chamber, but to absorb the story told in stone and pigment and form. The bathhouse was not merely where the body was purified, it was where the soul remembered its place in the great Roman narrative, a story of empire, of myth, of the gods who watched over it all, immortal and unmoving in their cold, beautiful marble repose. And so, after the mild, lulling warmth of the tepidarium has sunk into the limbs like the gentle hand of an old friend, the visitor moves further inward, deeper into the heart of the bathhouse, where the air itself seems to shimmer and breathe with a pulse of its own. This is the coldarium, the hottest of the rooms, and its entrance greets the bather, not with invitation but with a slow, unrelenting pressure of heat, like the opening of a furnace door that releases not flame but breathless, living steam. The moment the threshold is crossed, skin prickles, breath shortens, and the senses contract inward. This is not the gentle warmth of the previous chamber, but something ancient and immense, elemental, as if stepping into the lungs of Vulcan himself, the Roman god of fire and forge, who perhaps sleeps beneath the floors, breathing upward through the vents with a smouldering rhythm. The coldarium is a room built for extremes, long and narrow, its ceilings arched high to trap the rising steam, its walls tiled in smooth stone that gleams like wet bronze in the filtered light that pushes through small round windows far above eye level. These apertures let in the barest trace of daylight, no more than a soft haze, and so the space is dim, glowing from the inside with a golden fog, where every motion casts a long, ghostly echo in the mist. Here voices become whispers not by intent but by necessity. Sound is swallowed by vapor, and all things, men, columns, pools, appear slightly softened, their edges blurred as if the room were not quite finished forming. The marble benches that line the walls are warm to the touch, heated from beneath by the hypocausts, that miraculous underfloor heating system that sends columns of hot air flowing like invisible rivers through the hollow bricks and tunnels beneath the floor. The floor itself, surprisingly dry despite the wet air, radiates a constant deep warmth as if the earth itself had decided to comfort those who walked upon it. It is here that the body, now prepared, stripped, stretched, oiled, and gently warmed, meets its truest transformation. Muscles unwind completely, joints loosen in surrender, and even the mind, dulled by steam and slowness, begins to drift towards something dreamlike. The bather will lower himself into one of the hot pools that lie sunken into the stone floor, their waters as clear as glass, and as hot as memory. Slipping into such a pool is a ritual all its own, a slow descent guided by polished stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, until the water rises past the knees, the hips, the ribs, and finally envelops the shoulders in a trembling embrace that holds the body like a memory held close to the chest. Some will submerge fully, disappearing for a heartbeat, before emerging with dripping hair and closed eyes, as if momentarily baptized by the past. Around the edges of the room, others sit slouched in the vapor, eyes half-lidded, arms resting on knees, steam rising from their backs in silent trails, sweat beads on foreheads, rolls down cheeks, pools beneath the collarbone. Some press cold cloths to their brows, brought by slaves from the frigidarium in small ceramic bowls. Others breathe deeply through their mouths, taking in the mineral-rich air, which is said to cleanse not only the lungs but the spirit, though in truth many who speak of purification are really just giving language to the simple bliss of heat after a long day. The scent here is rich, muted and thick, a blend of warm limestone, moist air, eucalyptus or bay leaves sometimes thrown onto the furnace to scent the vapor, and the ever-present trace of olive oil that lingers on the skin and in the air like a second atmosphere. Conversations, when they happen, are short, soft, fragmented, not because of secrecy, but because speech takes effort, and here in the coldarium, effort is something gently and thoroughly discouraged. A nod replaces a sentence, a sigh replaces a reply. The silence is not empty but full of presence, of memory, of shared stillness. And all the while, beneath one's feet, the hypocaust breathe. Fires lit early in the morning by the bathhouse attendants, stoked constantly throughout the day, send hot air through the labyrinth of chambers beneath the floor. Clay pillars lift the marble surface a foot above the earth, allowing the heat to rise and radiate upward, not violently but insistently, like warmth rising through a lover's skin. This system, ancient even by Roman standards, was an engineering marvel, one that modern systems would not replicate for over 1,000 years. Yet here in this dim chamber of steam and silence, it functions invisibly reliably, as it always has, as it always will for as long as Rome breathes. Some bathers linger here for a long time, as long as they can bear, while others come only briefly, aware that the body can only hold so much heat before exhaustion sets in. Eventually, though, all must leave, their skin flushed red, their limbs heavy and relaxed, their hair damp and curled against their scalps. A few pause before exiting, placing their hands on the warm walls, either in reverence or simply to steady themselves, because the world outside the frigidarium feels for a moment like another world entirely, one of noise, movement, cold air and thinking. But within this chamber, they have been distilled to something simpler: breath, heat, silence, and sweat. And as the visitor slowly rises from the pool, steam clinging to the skin like a second robe, footsteps echoing softly on the heated tiles, the way forward leads them out of the heat, away from the searing comfort of the frigidarium, and toward the cool embrace of another space altogether, a chamber opposite in nature, where the body will be shocked, chilled and revived. It is to this place, the frigidarium, that the bather now slowly, quietly makes their. And so, as the bather emerges from the hot pool, breath slow and movement sluggish, he does not yet leave the frigidarium entirely. The path to the frigidarium waits still, but there is a pause, a sacred, unspoken interlude in the midst of transition. This moment is not rushed. It is taken in the still, steamy corners of the frigidarium itself, where the act of sweating becomes not merely a physiological response, but a ritual, quiet, involuntary, and deeply Roman in its reverence for balance between discipline and indulgence. The body, soaked from within and without, enters a stage of surrender, a gentle collapse of tension, where muscles have forgotten to be taut, where the bones themselves seem to melt softly into the posture of rest. One does not simply bathe in this room. One sweats, fully, with intent, and in that sweat lies something more ancient than hygiene. It is release, it is exposure, it is the shedding of more than dirt. Here, within the innermost sanctum of the baths, there are no sharp voices, no shouts, no laughter loud enough to echo. Conversations, if they happen at all, are like drifting wisps, fragments of thought, low and half-formed, trailing into vapor before they land. Two men may sit side by side for half an hour, and exchange no more than a sigh or a single sentence. And yet in that silence, there is communication. The heat strips away the unnecessary. The walls themselves seem to press gently inward, nudging egos into stillness. The nakedness of the body mirrors the nakedness of thought. In the frigidarium, all are equal, senator or soldier, merchant or slave, reduced to sweating, breathing forms, seeking ease in the same shared furnace. There is no place here for posturing. Steam does not care for status. Stone benches run along the perimeter, each one warm to the touch, and slick with the moisture of countless occupants before. Men recline, their backs pressed to the curved walls, heads tilted back, eyes closed. The occasional drip from the vaulted ceiling splashes gently onto bare shoulders, like the touch of a priest's hand in blessing. In the center, the heat still pulses upward from beneath the floor, a low and constant breath from the hypocaust, keeping the air at a nearly unbearable intensity. Some endure it gladly, their skin flushed and streaming with sweat, seeing the experience not just as relief for the flesh, but as a purification of spirit. Others tolerate it briefly, squinting into the mist, their thoughts wandering to the colder waters that await outside. And yet, the longer one stays, the more the heat becomes something other than heat. It becomes a pressure that softens resolve. It coaxes thoughts to the surface, thoughts too elusive or guarded to emerge in the cold light of daily life. Here, in this womb of stone and vapor, men have mused on the nature of the gods, debated the merits of stoicism over epicureanism, whispered quietly of debts owed or alliances needed. Philosophers have leaned forward, their foreheads beaded with sweat, to pose impossible questions about fate, freedom and duty, only to fall silent again, the answer less important than the act of asking it aloud. Deals have been struck here, quietly, under the guise of exhaustion, when defenses are low and honesty trickles out as easily as perspiration. There is a kind of truth in sweat, not the dramatic theatrical truth of rhetoric or politics, but the quiet truth of weariness. The caldarium humbles the strong and softens the stubborn. Its heat seeps past armor made of words and posture, finding the core of a man and holding it gently, insistently, until it yields. For some, this is uncomfortable, a confrontation with vulnerability. For others, it is a welcome relief. No masks survive long in the caldarium. Even the most carefully arranged expressions melt eventually, leaving only the raw, pink-faced truth of the body at rest. Some bathers bring oil flasks, small glass or clay vessels filled with scented mixtures, which they apply to their skin with slow, circular motions. Olive oil, sometimes mixed with myrrh, lavender, or rosemary, is rubbed into the limbs until the skin shines slick and fragrant. Then, with the help of a slave or a friend, it is scraped off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, a gentle scraping that removes both oil and the layer of sweat and grime it has drawn to the surface. This too is a ritual, rhythmic and almost meditative. The strigil glides along shoulders, backs, thighs, collecting the residue of exertion, of thought, of being. It is as if one is shedding not just physical waste but something symbolic, the weight of the day, the noise of the city, the clutter of identity. And through it all, time stretches, elongates, becomes unimportant. There are no clocks here, only the sense of heat and heartbeats. The longer one stays, the more the mind begins to drift, no longer tethered to action or conversation. The caldarium becomes not a room but a state, a moment suspended in steam and stillness. The ceiling above, often domed, arches high and echoes faintly with the sounds of dripping condensation. Carved into the stone or painted along the upper walls are faded depictions of gods and heroes. Neptune in his chariot, Hercules at rest, Venus emerging from the sea. They watch silently as generations pass below, each one sweating out its own struggles in the same sacred heat. Eventually, of course, the body begins to rebel. The pulse quickens, dizziness flirts at the edges of vision, and instinct nudges the bather toward cooler air. Some rise slowly, staggering for a moment before steadying themselves with a hand on the warm wall. Others move more quickly, craving the cold like salvation. But before leaving, many pause. They look once more around the room, at the steam drifting upward in columns, at the silent figures seated in reflection, at the gleam of sweat on skin, and feel, if only for a breath, that they have passed through something essential. Not a bath, not a chore, but a rite. And from this place of heat and surrender, the transition must now begin. The path leads away from warmth, from soft muscles and streaming skin, and toward the shock of cold that awaits beyond the arch. A return to alertness, to wakefulness, to life. For just beyond the final threshold of the caldarium lies the frigidarium, the cold plunge, the final station, where fire is met with ice and the cycle is complete. In the depths of the bathhouse, beyond the soft haze of the caldarium and the ritual surrender of sweat, lies a chamber reserved for those seeking something more intense, more searing, more transformative. This is the lacanicum, the dry, scorching hot room that functions like a Roman sauna, and it is entered by only the brave, or the most committed, after the long ritual of effort and cleansing. As the visitor crosses the threshold, the air shifts again, not damp and enveloping, but arid and searing. The change is immediate. Moisture becomes vapor, vapor becomes pressure, and pressure becomes a kind of whispered heat that beckons inward with both invitation and challenge. The walls are tiled in pale marble flecked with red and gold, baked by fires hidden deeper beneath, and the floor underfoot glows faintly, warm not from water but from dry, scorching air pushed through the hollow spaces of the hypocaust. There is no pool here, no water to soften the skin. Instead, the heat arrives as dry fire, a sensation that clings to bones, raises gooseflesh, and makes breathing deliberate. Inhale slowly, exhale slowly. Each breath warms the air within, sending a flicker of heat, tracing through the chest like a secret flame. Time stretches. The senses sharpen in opposition to the intense dryness. Every bead of sweat that forms on the skin is prized, a fragile testament to endurance, allowed to drip away and vanish in the heated atmosphere. Statues of gods stand watch from niches carved into the walls, Apollo with his calm, analytical expression, Venus poised in serene allure, Mars armored and alert, all rendered in polished marble that catches the flicker of flaming braziers in niches above. They observe silently as if judges or guardians, their presence imposing a quiet order on the savage warmth of the room. Unspoken, they suggest restraint. In their stony silence resides a reminder: this is not indulgence, but discipline, not pleasure but triumph. The Laconicum is a test, and its reward is heat-driven clarity. Visitors recline on stone benches that follow the curve of the room, or stand with backs pressed against the warm wall, their eyes fine lines of concentration, their breath matched to the pulse of the room. Sweat collects quickly, it does not drip, for there is no cool water, only evaporation against hot stone. Instead, moisture beads on foreheads, lips and chests, rolls slowly along contours before simply vanishing. Some bring oil to apply before entering. Light, fragrant olive oil brushed in a pattern that guarantees even the slightest sheen of protection. Others wear nothing, believing that skin exposed to the heat without barrier yields the truest transformation. Underfoot, the hypocausts continues its work, pushing dry, hot air from beneath the floor and through vents in the walls, until the chamber hums with an inner resonance. One can feel it in the soles of the feet, in the ribs, in the hollow space behind the eyes. It is living heat. It breathes beneath every tile, every seam, every corner. And above the ceiling, a shallow dome painted with sky blue pigment and scattered stars flickers in the torchlight, reminding bathers that though they dwell in a furnace, there remains a cosmos to contemplate. It is in this room that time fractures. 1 minute might stretch into 10, 10 into an hour. Breath becomes labor but also concentration. The body burns away remaining tension. Doubts, regrets and anxieties feel too trivial to occupy space. When someone enters the Laconicum for the first time, the initial shock might make them stagger, eyes wild, chest tight, only to settle moments later into a trance of endurance. Muscles that once ached relax completely. The mind drifts inward, into itself. Conversations are silent or absent. When they happen, they are suited to the environment. Terse, deliberate, minimal. Short remarks exchanged between seated men who stare fixedly at the wall or at each other, their faces glistening in heat, sweat dampening tunics laid aside. Here the body feels acutely alive, every pulse, every breath, every bead of sweat a sign of presence. There is no escape from sensation, no respite from pressure. For some this is terrifying, for others almost divine. It is said that emperors who wished to contemplate decisions would sit in the Laconicum, seeking clarity in the crucible of heat, to sweat out selfish ambition, to cleanse indecision, to emerge more decisive, more certain, at least so the rumors say. Often a slave or attendant offers a cloth dampened in fragrant water at the doorway to wipe down hands or backs once the body aches beyond comfort. No splash of pool awaits here, only movement toward a cooler space or a plunge into cold water elsewhere in the bathhouse. But many stay longer, seated, still, silent, until exhaustion seeps in. The knees buckle slightly, the vision blurs at the edges, and the body demands relief. The acts of breathing, standing, sweating become meditation. The heat is not torture but transformation. Inhale the dry fire, exhale the weight, and in each breath, feel something simpler reveal itself. Not worldly concern but presence. Eventually a chosen few step from the room, pacing slowly as they leave the blazing chamber behind. Their skin appears flushed, polished, and pins of sweat still drip faintly from their temples. Their breaths deep and slow, they move toward the opposite extreme, the frigidarium, where cold water awaits to seal their passage, to refresh limbs, to awaken the sense. Yet before that plunge, there is thoughtfulness. Men seated on the threshold, wiping brows, speaking in soft tones, maybe of simplicity, maybe of gratitude, maybe simply asking permission of the heat to let go of the session. Some lean forward and touch the marble walls with closed eyes, offering thanks or farewell, a silent ritual of respect for the heat that tested them. And when the time finally comes, they step forth, not hurriedly but deliberately, from the burning silence into the cool hush beyond. Each step is measured, each breath prepared. The door swings shut behind them with a soft click, and a sudden drop in temperature offers itself an invitation, a shock, a reward to receive them next. As the searing heat of the lacanacum fades into memory, the world re-enters through a softer threshold. The murmur of voices, the wet slap of footsteps, the clink of oil flasks return to polished stone shelves. The bathhouse, for all its marble and ritual, is not only a sanctuary of the body, it is, more crucially, an engine of society. Beneath its domes and arches, beneath the mosaics of gods and beasts, and the faintest scent of oil and rosewater lingering in the air, exists something quieter but far more consequential than steam conversation, and through it, the subtle shifting of power, influence, and the fragile, slippery thing called favor. In these spaces, arranged not by class but by habit and schedule, the distinctions of Roman society soften just enough to allow words to slip between mouths that might never otherwise meet. Senators recline on cushioned benches in the tepidarium, arms spread, bellies glistening, brows furrowed not from heat, but from negotiations disguised as gossip. Merchants, their fingers ink-stained or rough from counting coin, speak softly in corners with men who wear the rings of former magistrates. Soldiers, pausing between postings or victories, offer stories from the frontier, each tale seasoned with blood, dust, or rumor. And poets, ever half forgotten and half worshipped, recite lines not yet written down, hoping the right ear overhears. No introductions are needed here. Eyes scan faces, recalling names, debts, and favors. A nod, a glance, the gentle tap of a sandal against the smooth tile floor, all of it carries meaning. In the world beyond the walls, wealth and power wear armor and laurels. Inside, they wear little at all, save for confidence and the ability to read a room. The conversations begin as drift. One man comments on the heat of the caldarium. Another agrees, adding a passing thought about the governor's latest edict. A third joins, correcting the detail, mentioning he heard differently from someone close to the Senate floor. The topic changes fluidly. War, grain prices, temple repairs, the morality of the youth. Then, almost without warning, the air thickens, not from steam but from significance. The names dropped now matter. The pauses between words stretch just enough to allow meaning to ferment. Eyes flicker toward entrances. Who is listening? Who is not? In these moments, alliances are formed not with oaths, but with shared laughter, a brief compliment or a simple silence, held at the right time. One hand on another's shoulder can be reassurance or warning. A shared drink of honeyed water might seal a decision already made in the subtext of a joke. This is the politics of proximity, of warmth, of skin exposed and defenses dropped, just enough to see the man beneath the office. Deals are made, not declared. A senator needs olive oil shipped from the east. The merchant, half submerged in a pool, says he knows someone in Antioch. A general seeks support for a military campaign. His friend, the poet, offers to compose a stirring verse about duty and honor, to be read aloud at the next forum. A freedman, newly wealthy and eager for status, gifts a basket of rare figs to a man whose patronage could open every door in the Aventine. No parchment is signed, no seal is pressed, only a glance, a promise, a casual phrase spoken between baths. Consider it done, you have my ear. He owes me a favor, I'll speak to him. Even those with little authority understand the game. Slaves move silently between chambers, but their ears are sharp. A dropped sentence here, a name overheard there, and suddenly the bathhouse becomes a repository of whispered intelligence. Freedmen, once slaves themselves, are especially attuned. They speak carefully, always aware that knowledge, even partial, even fragmented, can be the currency that buys opportunity or survival. Not all conversations are so veiled. Some are loud, performative, intentionally overheard. A man boasts of his connections to the consul. Another loudly derides the emperor's newest marble statue, claiming the pose is unnatural. Laughter follows, too loud, too eager, because the remark was meant to be heard. These theatrics serve a purpose. They send signals, attract allies, draw attention like birds puffing feathers in the forum. Occasionally conflict stirs. Two men, once friends, sit on opposite sides of the tepidarium. and pretend not to see each other. Their mutual silence is a kind of duel, sharpened not by blades but by omission. Others notice. The silence speaks volumes. Alliances shift accordingly. And then there are the quiet observers. The old magistrate who no longer speaks, but watches everything. His gaze slow and patient like a tortoise sizing up the tide. The young equestrian who says little but listens well, soaking in phrases and names, storing them for another time, another need. These men are dangerous in their own way, because power in the bathhouse is not just what is said, it is what is remembered, and who remembers it. It is not unusual for a man to leave the bathhouse cleaner in body, but burdened in mind, a compliment that felt too sweet, a promise that came too easily, a name mentioned in passing that echoes strangely in the night. These moments cling, fester, grow roots, and before long a conversation held between soaks has become a policy enacted, a favor called in, a life changed forever. Even emperors understood the importance of this place. Some came disguised, cloaked in the simplicity of a citizen. Others built private bathhouses to control the flow of information. A whisper in steam, after all, could be more dangerous than a spear. And yet, despite its undercurrents of politics and strategy, the bathhouse is never stripped of humanity. Men still laugh, old friends still embrace, children splash in corners while their fathers plot futures. The air still carries the sense of mint and myrrh. The walls still echo with the rise and fall of voices. It is a place where power reveals its soft underbelly, where influence sweats beside anonymity. And as the final conversations fade, as the sandals are reclaimed and the last glances exchanged, each man steps into the cooling air outside the bathhouse, not quite the same as he entered, for in the heat and hush of these marble rooms, something has shifted, not just in skin but in stand. And now, warmed by influence and sweat alike, the body seeks its final balance, not in words but in water. Ahead lies the frigidarium, the cold plunge, the last cleansing ritual before the outside world returns. From the warmth of whispered conspiracies and the slow unraveling of bodies in the tepidarium, a final transformation remains. It does not arrive with ceremony or announcement, but with the sudden, almost irreverent gasp that escapes a man's mouth as his flesh touches something ancient and unmerciful. The frigidarium, the cold plunge, the abrupt end to heat, indulgence, and all that came before. It waits at the far edge of the bathhouse, its waters still and glassy like the eyes of a statue, while the kildarium radiates fire and mist, and the tepidarium soothes with warmth and chatter. The frigidarium makes no such overture. It offers no scent, no invitation, only a chill that emanates like a ghost from the marble lip of the pool. A quiet promise of clarity sharpened by pain. And yet men come, always they come, not because they must, but because the ritual is incomplete without this final, bracing conclusion. There is no standard way to enter. Some descend with the stoicism of soldiers into battle, lips pressed thin, breath held tight, as if confronting an old debt they once ran from. Others laugh, shout, curse in Latin and Greek as they fall in together, their splashes sending arcs of icy water across the painted walls. A few pace the edge, toes curled, eyes wide, like boys again, hesitating, daring, pretending not to fear what they know is coming, but all go in eventually. To skip the frigidarium is to walk out of the bathhouse unfinished, incomplete, no matter one's courage, rank, or tolerance. The cold calls. The moment the body meets the water, it forgets everything. All concerns, business, politics, flirtation, fatigue, are ripped from the mind, like a sheet pulled from a sleeping form. Breath flees, limbs the skin, flushed red from the heat, turns pale, tightens, contracts around muscle and bone. Time distorts. A single second feels suspended, infinite, and in that moment, a man feels reborn, not in the grand sense of ceremony or religion, but in a quieter, deeper way, reborn into sensation, reborn into presence. The water is not merely cold, it is holy in its own fashion, drawn from underground sources, kept in deliberate shadow, untouched by fire or sun. The pool exists in defiance of everything that came before. Where steam once opened the pores, the chill now seals them. Where the body once slackened and melted, it now hardens and resolves. Muscles pull inward, drawing tight. Hearts beat faster, then stronger. Eyes widen, sharpen. Minds fogged by heat and discussion, now clear as glass. The frigidarium does not soothe, it awakens. Even the acoustics change here. The gentle roar of steam is gone, replaced by sharper echoes. The crisp splash of limbs striking water, the hiss of breath taken too fast, the bark of startled laughter. These sounds reverberate with a clarity the other rooms lack. There is something honest about the noise here. No ambiguity, no nuance, just the raw involuntary exclamations of men plunged into a truth they cannot argue with. Children are the boldest. They leap in without thought, shrieking with a delight that bounces off the walls like birds startled from a grove. Their fathers, grimacing at first, follow with practiced resignation, knowing that the cold they dread will soon become the relief they crave. The elderly ease in with the slowness of tide, each step deliberate, each inhale a soft prayer. Their joints, swollen from time and toil, find something restorative in the chill. For a moment, their age recedes, and in this space, perhaps more than any other, the great leveling of the bathhouse reveals itself. Naked, shivering, teeth chattering, a senator looks no different from a slave, an aging merchant, no different from a poet. The water strips away the layers, social, physical, emotional, until all that remains is the man and his reaction to discomfort. Some endure it with stoicism, others with humor, but all endure it together. Not every man stays. The plunge is often just that, a brief immersion, a momentary cleansing, followed by a hurried return to warmth and towel. Yet for a few, the frigidarium becomes a dwelling place. They remain suspended, arms outstretched along the marble edge, heads tilted back, eyes closed, letting the cold dig its fingers into every crevice of their being. These men speak of clarity, of silence, of the purity that only cold water offers after the haze of steam. Physicians, ever eager to explain what tradition already knew, would later speak of the health benefits, that the cold tightened the skin, improved circulation, closed the pores, and sealed in the oils applied during the strigal ritual, that it reduced swelling, sharpened the senses, fortified the spirit. But long before Galen's scrolls, the Romans needed no justification beyond how it made them feel. That was reason enough. For some, the cold water is a mirror. In its surface they see not their reflection, but something deep, a memory stirred loose, a regret that floats, ghost-like across the pool. The bathhouse is a space for the living, yes, but the frigidarium in its solemn stillness is where the past sometimes returns. A soldier remembers a campaign lost, a father recalls the son who drowned, a man freshly shaved and laughing with friends suddenly finds himself quiet, staring at the tiled bottom uncertain why, and then just as quickly it passes. A splash, a joke, a dripping slap of feet against stone as someone races out, arms crossed, calling for a towel. The solemnity breaks like thin ice, life rushes back in, the cold has done its work. Leaving the frigidarium feels like emerging into a new world. The skin tingles, the breath comes easier, the heart, no longer stunned by chill, finds its rhythm again. Men rub their arms, slap their chests, laugh at each other's shivering, all the while knowing that they have completed something, not just a bath but a rite. Because the bathhouse is not simply about cleanliness, it is about transition, from public to private, from tension to ease, from self to society, and back again. And the frigidarium, with its sharp teeth and honest silence, is the final door through which all must pass before re-entering the world they left behind. Outside, beyond the thresholds of the bathhouse, life continues. Crowded forums, dusty streets, debts unpaid, letters unanswered, feasts to attend, enemies to avoid. But for now, the men who stepped into the cold emerged changed, awakened, finished. And as the last droplets roll from their skin onto the sun-warmed stone, the ritual stands complete. And yet, even as laughter echoed and droplets of cold water ran in rivulets down shivering backs and necks, another rhythm pulsed beneath the marble surfaces. one not made of conversation or heat or splashes, but of footsteps and gestures that were never quite permitted to be seen fully in the center of the stage. For while the Roman citizen basked in sensory indulgence and social performance, the real machinery of the bathhouse ticked on in silence, upheld by the countless bodies who worked behind the walls, in the passageways, and across the shadowy edges of every chamber, the slaves and attendants whose labor made everything possible, and whose presence, though constant, was seldom more than peripheral. They were there from the moment a visitor stepped inside the threshold. In the apoditarium, they awaited with practiced hands, folding tunics, tying sandals, tucking away personal belongings into secure cubbies, perhaps even whispering a reminder or a warning if valuables were at risk. These were not idle servants, but swift, knowing workers, often assigned to the same master day after day, developing a wordless familiarity, the rhythm of assistance. Some were young boys purchased for their nimbleness, others older men with the muscle for lifting, for guarding, for holding heavy buckets of water drawn again and again from deep cisterns. Elsewhere, beyond the steamy realm of the caldarium, unseen hands shoveled charcoal into the mouths of the hypocausts fire chambers, stoking the heat that rose up through flues and stone and warmed the bellies of rooms above. These fire attendants, blackened with soot and sweat, labored in suffocating conditions, never seeing the marbled splendor their efforts supported. They worked in shifts, their lives confined to the underbellies of the city, tending to the breath of warmth that floated effortlessly into the tepidarium and the lacanicum as if summoned by divine will. In the palestra, oil boys circled the athletes, holding small ceramic vessels in cloth-wrapped hands. They approached quietly without disturbing the contests or conversations, offering a pour of olive oil to an extended palm or assisting with the anointing ritual before exercise. When sweat had built and the sun had baked it into the skin, they would kneel beside their patrons with a strigil in hand, curving the metal blade along the arm, the back, the thigh, with practiced gentleness, scraping away the layer of grime and fatigue. Their touch was neither tender nor cold. It was dutiful, impersonal, part of the ritual texture of bathing. Sometimes they overheard names, secrets, the rise and fall of laughter, but it was not their place to remember. They were to listen without hearing, to watch without seeing, to serve without presence. Even in the smallest moments of silence, a slave was present. Tiled floors did not clean themselves. Pools required endless tending. The waters of the frigidarium had to be refreshed and kept crisp through the workings of underground aqueducts, where water slaves labored day and night to ensure purity. Towels appeared precisely when needed, not too soon, never too late. Oil was replenished, sandals fetched, tunics warmed by the wall near the furnaces. In the occasional moments when an accident or scuffle broke the tranquility, it was the slaves who intervened, not with force, but with careful discretion. They were the bathhouse's nervous system, quietly regulating every movement so that the illusion of effortless luxury never faltered. Some of them were trained to listen, not just passively but for purpose. Wealthy patrons sometimes planted slaves in the crowd, told them to note the words of rivals, the plans of senators, the whispers of military officers with ambitions too grand for their rank. These slaves returned at night, reported what they'd heard, and disappeared again the next day among the ranks of attendants, invisible in their presence, indispensable in their purpose. The most trusted slaves, however, remained closest to their masters, never leaving their side. These were not simply bathhouse workers, but lifelong extensions of a man's power and privacy. They knew which muscle ached, which scent was preferred, how to knot the belt just so. Their lives were spent in mimicry of care, attending to the skin, to the voice, to the small signs of anger or pleasure, and in some cases they were more than attendants. They were companions, confidants, lovers, healers. In Rome, intimacy and ownership often blurred together. There were also the female slaves, though they occupied a different realm. In bathhouses where mixed-gender access was allowed, or in sections reserved for women, female attendants mirrored the same role. They rubbed oil into tired limbs, helped remove jewelry and hairpins, and whispered quiet encouragement to matronae, trying to keep their dignity afloat in a space that was both liberating and exposing. These women were often more vulnerable, their roles more precarious. A glance held too long, or a misstep in protocol could shift their fate. Still, not all was pain and servitude. Some slaves carved niches of identity and agency within this system. A skilled masseur might gain fame and be requested by name. An oil boy with charm might catch the eye of a wealthy merchant, securing a better post or, in rare cases, his freedom. The bathhouse, like Rome itself, was a place of hierarchy, but also of chance, of whispered assents and unspoken ambition. So as the steam clung to the ceiling and cooled along the mosaic tiles, the bathhouse sang with 1,000 unseen voices, of those who made the experience seamless, who bent behind the curtain of Roman grandeur. They moved in silence, so that others might they toiled in heat, so others might relax, and though their names were rarely etched into history, their fingerprints were everywhere, beneath the marble, in the plaster, on the very air itself, and in the quiet after the frigidarium's shiver, and the soft return of warmth along the dressing corridors. One could feel their presence still, not as shadows, but as rhythm, a rhythm that guided visitors forward, gently now toward another chamber of the Roman experience, a space where body and skin met in a new kind of touch. The touch that, for some, came not from oil boys or burly masseurs, but from the gentler hands of familiar women, calloused, but soft, perfumed and precise. For while the Roman baths were often imagined as male domains, forums of flexed egos, tanned shoulders, and political maneuvering, there existed just beyond the shared atriums and echoing palaestrae, another world entirely. A world marked not by masculine display, but by quieter rituals, feminine communion, and the intimate, unhurried rhythm of women at the baths. Their domain was sometimes entirely separate, an annex of the main structure, or an independent complex altogether, known as the balneae muliarum. In some cities, women bathed only during specific hours, in the morning when the fires were just catching and the water only lukewarm. In others, they had free access throughout the day, often depending on class, custom, and the tolerance of the ruling magistrates. But whether they entered under the eye of law, or through the influence of wealth, women's experiences in the baths bore familiar textures, and yet markedly distinct patterns. Here, one would not find the gladiatorial contests of the palestra, or the roaring debates about war and taxes. Instead, there was a different kind of performance, subtler, no less important. Among the columns and fountains, matronae shed their stolas and peplos, revealing bodies softened by childbirth, marked by life, or still firm in youthful curve. They did not hide, nor flaunt. Older women guided younger ones through the rituals of oil and clay, of how best to loosen the tension at the base of the spine, how to wrap hair in cloth, so the steam would not frizz it beyond recognition. They spoke in tones not of conquest but of memory, of sons, of missing sisters, of gardens, of whispered ailments. The rituals of the women's bath began slowly, often without fanfare. First the disrobing, the folding of garments, the wrapping of jewelry and linen, tucked away in carved niches, guarded by trusted slaves. Then the warm oiling of the limbs, not for seduction, but for care, an act of stewardship over the body, of honoring its burden. They massaged the calves with upward strokes, combed the scalp with fingers steeped in myrrh, and laughed, not loud or raucous, but bright and full, laughter that echoed between the arches like birdsong at dawn. Slaves tended them here as well, though often female, and more likely to engage in quiet companionship. These attendants helped with washing, braiding, rubbing fragrant unguents into the skin. The air here smelled not of sweat and smoke, but of rose oil, coriander, and almond. Time passed slowly. Women came not just to clean themselves, but to unburden, to listen, to advise. It was not uncommon for midwives to be consulted in the caldarium's corners, for herbs to be recommended for fertility or digestion, for small amulets to be exchanged to protect against the evil eye. The envy that passed among them was rarely spoken. It was in the glance at a rival's ivory bracelet, the flush in the cheek at a compliment too sincere, the way a younger woman might shift slightly to catch more steam upon her chest. Yet even this envy was ritualized, contained within the framework of community. These women saw each other not only in undress, but in vulnerability, in grief, in joy. Bonds formed here were not merely social, they were ancestral. The bathhouse served as a second hearth, a kind of domestic theatre, where wives, widows, mothers, and daughters found continuity. There were also women of different stations, freed women, merchants, artisans, who bathed alongside nobler matronae, sometimes in designated areas, sometimes separated only by caste. And then there were those whose professions centered around seduction, the courtesans, the entertainers, women whose beauty was currency. Their presence was both admired and begrudged. They were studied silently, emulated quietly, their hairstyles mimicked, their fragrances noted. A young girl might watch one recline in the tepidarium and think of futures she was not yet allowed to name. Children, too, were often present, small girls wrapped in damp tunics, splashing by the foot of a mosaic fountain, giggling as mothers poured lukewarm water from jugs. Lessons were taught here, not by lecture, but by example: how to hold oneself, how to be still in a world of noise, how to care for one's body not out of vanity, but because it bore history. And yet, the women's bathhouse was not devoid of politics. Gossip flowed as freely as water. Rumors were washed and rewashed, shared in low voices under archways, filtered through the steam. News of betrothals, of scandals, of deaths at sea or fortunes won. These tidings moved between women long before they reached the ears of men in the forum. The bathhouse was not merely a space of leisure, it was a crucible of knowledge, of social navigation, a realm where influence moved like perfume, unseen but persistent. When the time came to leave, robes were fastened again, hair was pinned, and rings slid back onto softened fingers. Faces bore the glow of steam and satisfaction, limbs hung looser, hearts lighter. Some lingered by the atrium's door, exchanging final words, offering brief kisses to cheek or hand. Then they stepped back into the Roman world, one foot in the domestic, the other in the civic, but carrying with them the stillness of stone benches, the scent of rosewater, the laughter of women who understood each other without needing to explain. And behind them the bathhouse quieted again, its tiles still warm, its oil still fragrant, as the rhythm shifted once more, and others began to enter. For whether it was laughter or labor, politics or perfume, the Roman baths remained always in motion. And now, through inner corridors heavy with scent and silence, we are drawn toward another chamber, where the senses once again awaken, this time not by heat or steam, but by the sharp memory of ancient stuff. The architectural harmony of the Roman bathhouse did more than elevate the spirit. It also served as a quiet ally in the pursuit of health, forming the heart of a curative culture where medicine, ritual, and heat intertwined beneath the vaulted ceilings and misted stone. For the Roman bathhouse was not only a temple of society or pleasure, nor just an architectural marvel. It was also, and quite quietly, a kind of clinic, a place where medicine and comfort intertwined so seamlessly that few thought to separate the two. One did not come merely to clean the skin, or to gossip, or to debate. One came also to be restored, to balance the humours, to silence the ache in bone or mind. In marble alcoves and steamy recesses, the boundaries between leisure and remedy dissolved like salt in water. Physicians, or those who called themselves such, often loitered near the entrances of the larger bath complexes, dressed not in robes of authority but in the same tunics as their clients. They were not surgeons in the modern sense, nor scholars of anatomy in any rigorous form, but they knew through apprenticeship, through observation, through law and scroll, and sometimes through guesswork, that the bathhouse offered relief. And Romans, whether senators or slaves, believed deeply in this quiet alchemy, that heat, water, oil, and steam could coax the body back into alignment. Baths were prescribed like potions. For aching joints, a long sit in the caldarium, followed by a bracing splash in the frigidarium. For sluggish digestion, a brisk rub-down in the apodyterium, sometime in dry heat, and a walk through the tepid mist. For melancholy, a full cycle, repeated thrice, broken by gentle conversation, light wine, and the comfort of familiar voices, echoing against travertine walls. The process was seldom formalized, yet well understood. No tablet carved in stone listed these regimens, But every seasoned Roman carried the knowledge in muscle and memory. Rest was part of the prescription. No one rushed in a bathhouse, for to hurry was to invite imbalance. Even the strong men, those who flung weights in the palestra or twisted necks in wrestling bouts, took their time after exercise to slow the body's rhythm. They might sit for long minutes in the sudatorium, letting the sweat drag out the residue of effort, or lie flat upon stone, eyes closed, as a slave pressed fragrant cloths along the spine. The very stones of the bath knew the order: exertion, release, rinse. Some bathhouses employed their own Medici balnea bath physicians, men who walked the halls with baskets of herbs or bundles of wrapped leeches. They would recommend decoctions of chamomile or rue, suggest poultices for twisted ankles, or gently palpate the belly of an older man complaining of wind. They were not always accurate, they were not always gentle, but they were often right enough. And when they were not, the bathhouse itself stepped in, its temperatures and textures forming a kind of passive medicine, curing not by precision but by ritual. Women too sought healing here, though their needs were often framed in quieter tone. The midwives and wise women among them brought herbs tied in cloth, whispered advice by the baths, prepared infusions from fennel or myrtle. They understood that the wound could be soothed by warm stone, that grief could be lightened by steam, that the ache of love or childbirth could ease however slightly, beneath the slow drip of warm water echoing in silence. Some claimed that conception was more likely after a thorough bathing, others said it was a protection against it. The bath neither confirmed nor denied, it simply received. Beyond ailments of the flesh, the Roman bath treated the mind, though no one used such term. Melancholy was not depression, it was an excess of black bile, yet even without modern terminology, the bath served as balm. Men burdened by debt or disgrace might emerge looking younger, their brows softened by heat. Women mourning the loss of children would soak in silence, surrounded by companions who asked no questions but stayed close. The very rhythm of the place, the echoes, the warmth, the shared humanity, did the work of medicine even when medicine failed. Roman writers spoke of the baths as curative spaces, praising their effect on digestion, on skin tone, on temperament. Seneca warned of the noise but acknowledged the value. Pliny advised specific sequences, always returning to the wisdom of balance. Galen, that most meticulous of ancient physicians, wrote of how bathing aligned the body's internal fires with its outward needs. To bathe was to recalibrate, to bring the self back into proportion with the world. The ritual of scraping oil from the body with a strigil was not just hygienic, it was symbolic. The removal of sweat, dirt and dead skin was imagined as a peeling away of weakness, of imbalance. Some men believed that the bath purged not only the body but the soul, though such talk was rare in Roman pragmatism. Still, the feeling afterward, the lightness in the limbs, the calm behind the eyes, hinted at something deeper than physical care. It was the sensation of having been undone and remade, gently, slowly, in steam and silence. And so, day after day, generation after generation, Romans returned to their baths, not merely out of habit or custom, but from a kind of medical intuition. They knew long before charts and syringes that the body responded to heat and rhythm, to water and weight. They understood that health was not just the absence of illness, but the presence of balance, and that the bathhouse with its vaulted rooms and heated stones offered balance as its quiet gift. Long before the hum of modern machines or the flicker of electric light, the Romans built structures that defied both time and gravity, and nowhere was their architectural genius more serenely expressed than in the quiet grandeur of the bathhouse. These were not mere collections of rooms for washing, they were vast, deliberate spaces of ritualized flow and quiet mastery, constructed stone by stone, with an eye not only to utility, but to the subtle orchestration of experience. One did not simply enter a bathhouse, one was absorbed by it, led by warm currents of air, shifting textures underfoot, and echoing domes above that seemed to cradle every whispered breath. The moment one stepped through the entrance arch, often shaded by colonnades or frescoed vestibules, the air began to change, cool in the outer chambers, heavy and scented in the inner ones. The very atmosphere was engineered. Vaulted ceilings captured warmth without stifling. Oculi, circular skylights, filtered daylight in delicate shafts across mosaic floors. The acoustics, even if unintended, softened voices and magnified laughter, so that the space seemed always both intimate and endless. It was architecture not just for function or form, but for sensation. Beneath these tranquil exteriors, however, the beating heart of the bathhouse pulsed with engineering marvels. Chief among them was the hypocausts, an underfloor heating system that defies belief even today. Great furnaces, called praefurnia, burned wood or charcoal, and their heat was channeled through hollow spaces beneath raised floors, sometimes climbing through clay flues embedded in the wall. Slaves stoked these fires in sweltering service, often unseen, while patrons above walked barefoot on gently warmed tiles, unaware or uninterested in the mechanism, but ever grateful for its effect. It was, in its way, a kind of elemental magic: fire warming stone, stone warming space, space warming flesh. The movement of water, too, was a masterpiece of precision. Bronze taps, expertly cast and fitted, could direct the flow of hot, cold, or tepid water with surprising ease. Lead pipes, though later suspected of leaching their own quiet poison, carried vast volumes of water from aqueducts to bathhouses, where it was stored in cisterns or allowed to cascade into pools via sculpted spouts. In some of the grander thermae, like those built by emperors, water wheels turned ceaselessly, lifting and pouring, powered by slave labor or the simple force of gravity. Even the overflow was managed. Drains chiseled into marble floors carried waste water away silently, without odor or fuss. Each chamber within the bathhouse was carefully positioned, not randomly laid but arranged along invisible axes of temperature and progression. One entered first into the apoditerium, the changing room, usually flanked by benches and lined with niches for clothing. From there one might pass into the tepidarium, a gentle room of mild warmth, designed to soothe and prepare the body. The caldarium followed, hot, steamy, humid, its walls sweating alongside the patrons. And finally, for those brave enough, the frigidarium, with its cold plunge pool, a shock to the system, invigorating and precise. The transition between rooms was part of the ritual, a slow unfolding, like a flower opening to the sun, each chamber a petal of experience. Domes loomed over the central rooms, not merely for grandeur but for function. Their high curvature allowed hot air to rise, creating natural convection that kept the lower parts of the room comfortable. These domes were often coffered, their recessed panels not only reducing weight, but casting soft shadows that danced as light shifted throughout the day. Windows, rarely plain rectangles, were arched or oculi-shaped, some glazed with thin sheets of mica or horn, allowing diffuse light to pour in without wind. Even the floors, sometimes of plain stone, sometimes in dazzling mosaics of colored tiles, were laid not only to delight the eye but to channel water, warmth and sound with intention. Materials varied by region and wealth, but always the emphasis was on balance, between weight and beauty, between permanence and peace. Travertine blocks formed the skeleton of many bathhouses, durable and easy to quarry. Brick-faced concrete, a Roman innovation, gave the walls strength while allowing for elegant curves. Marble was common in the wealthier baths, carved into seats, columns and even base. Inlays of serpentine, porphyry, or onyx might catch the eye at a threshold or beneath a basin, a quiet reminder of empire's reach. Stone from Egypt, from Gaul, from Asia Minor, brought to this singular temple of comfort. No less important were the walls and ceilings themselves, often decorated with frescoes, scenes of myth, of sea nymphs, of gods at play, or stucco reliefs that added texture to the gently curving surface. In the steam these images softened, blurred slightly, becoming dreams rather than decoration. Light from bronze lamps danced across them, and the sound of dripping water echoed gently off their painted curve. To stand still in a Roman bathhouse was to find oneself inside an artwork that had no beginning or end, only rhythm, temperature, and time. Even the external courtyards and palaestrae, open-air spaces for exercise and sun, were framed with intention. Columns formed covered walkways, fountains burbled at their centers. The bath complex was never isolated. It was embedded within the urban fabric, its architecture echoing civic pride and imperial power. It stood not only as a monument to engineering, but as a declaration: here in this city people could live not just safely or functionally, but beautifully. It is worth remembering that many of these great bathhouses, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, were built by emperors not just for the people but for legacy. In stone and brick, they etched their names into the communal body, providing not just comfort but a kind of immortality. Their inscriptions still crown broken entrances. Their intentions, though centuries old, still echo in the warm, dry silence of ruins. Today those ruins remain, arches without roofs, floors without walls. And yet even in decay they whisper of precision, of water that once flowed in loops, of fire channeled beneath marble, of voices lifted in conversation beneath domes that never echoed too loudly, of a society that understood perhaps better than ours, that the human body thrives not just in health, but in harmony, and that harmony is something one must build brick by brick, chamber by chamber, warmed by fire and cooled by stone. In the soft hush that followed a warm plunge or a quiet sweat, a visitor to the grand Roman bathhouses might find themselves drawn not to a towel or the changing rooms, but to another kind of chamber entirely, one where steam gave way to silence, and the wet gleam of marble floors was replaced by the dry, worn texture of scroll shelves and the quiet rustle of papyrus. For in these architectural marvels, beyond the caldarium and frigidarium, beyond even the murmuring fountains and colonnaded palaestrae, stood spaces dedicated not to cleansing the body but to nourishing the mind. Libraries, shaded gardens, lecture alcoves, and whispering porticos, all integrated seamlessly into the design, as if Romans understood that leisure, in its fullest form, must include the contemplative, as well as the corporeal. Step past the atrium and through an arched corridor, perhaps cooled by the ambient breeze of moving water, or warmed faintly by residual hypocaust flow, and you might enter a library, not vast like Alexandria, nor guarded like a temple, but welcoming in its modest grandeur. The walls were often lined with recesses, each one filled with wooden cabinets, and inside those cabinets, scrolls tightly wound, inked carefully, organized by author, subject or theme, scrolls on philosophy, rhetoric, history, agriculture, manuals for orators, poetry from the Augustan age, speeches of Cicero, fragments of Lucretius. This was not merely a place to pass time. It was a quiet sanctum where the noise of the street and the humidity of the bath gave way to the dry silence of thought. Patrons, some still in tunics damp from the frigidarium, others wrapped in cloaks against the coolness, would lower themselves onto benches or stools placed with care along the library's periphery. There was no shushing librarian, no harsh lighting, only the ambient echo of sandals on stone, the creak of wood as a scroll was lifted, the murmur of a tutor explaining some stoic principle to a young pupil. Light filtered through high, narrow windows, casting slanted beams that illuminated the motes of dust floating between rows of words that had outlived their authors. Time slowed here, thoughts stretched out. One could spend minutes or hours with a text, rereading a phrase, gazing out a window toward a distant cypress, or simply sitting in stillness, as the mind wandered in the company of the ancients. But not all reflection took place within walls. Equal care had been given to the design of gardens, those cloistered outdoor rooms, nestled within the walls of the Thermae, where colonnades formed shaded walkways, and central paths led past low shrubs and trickling fountains. These were not wild, sprawling landscapes, but manicured spaces of order and elegance. Stone benches curved beneath fig trees, statues of muses or emperors watched silently from pedestals, wrapped in ivy. Birds called faintly from niches where feeders had been hidden, and the ever-present sound of moving water, from a lion's mouth spout or a tiered basin, provided a soft musical backdrop to every thought, every breath. Here friends gathered not for sport or commerce, but for discussion. A pair of philosophers debating the virtue of restraint, a soldier recounting a dream to a friend, a senator's wife reading Ovid aloud to her slave girl, Conversations rose and fell like the wind in the laurels, never loud, never urgent. The garden was a stage for dialogue, and every leaf and stone bore silent witness to the centuries of quiet speech that had passed among them. Even the paving stones, laid in gentle geometric patterns, seemed to guide the steps not toward speed but toward intention. In some of the larger Thermae, like those of Caracalla or Trajan, these gardens were vast, pathways forked like thoughts, leading to secluded niches, where lovers might meet or where an elderly man might close his eyes in the sun and remember a campaign long past. Some corners held sundials, their shadows marking time in ways that felt more poetic than precise. Others offered tiny herb beds, lavender, mint, rosemary, not for cooking but for in the early hours of morning before the bathhouse filled, these spaces could feel like temples to memory, holding within them not just the flora of empire, but the dreams of those who walked their path. To the modern mind, it may seem odd to find libraries and gardens in places built primarily for bathing, but to the Roman way of thinking this was not just logical, it was essential. The bathhouse was not a spa or a gym in the modern sense. It was a cultural organism, a place where the threads of physical health, intellectual development, social cohesion, and aesthetic pleasure were braided into a single, deliberate experience. It was, quite literally, a manifestation of Roman ideals, discipline and indulgence, order and beauty, strength and wisdom. Even the placement of these spaces within the overall layout of the bathhouse was thoughtful. The library was often situated near the warmer rooms, where one could drift naturally after a steam, the heat leaving the body, the mind slowly cooling into lucidity. The gardens, meanwhile, bordered exercise spaces or the edge of the complex, open to the sky but protected from wind. Together they formed the lungs and the soul of the Thermae, places where one could draw breath, and where thought could linger without urgency. In time, as empires waned and priorities shifted, many of these integrated spaces disappeared. Libraries were looted, scrolls burned or lost to mildew, gardens overgrew, their symmetry swallowed by vines and dust, but the stones remained, a cracked basin here, a weathered bench and in the ruins of old bathhouses, under sun or starlight, one can still imagine the conversations, the poetry, the soft sound of a page being unrolled. One can almost feel the peace that once stretched out across the columns, long after the baths had closed and the crowds had gone, a peace rooted not in silence, but in harmony. Here then, was the Roman bathhouse in its fullest form, not just a building of function, but a canvas for civilization itself, where water cleansed the skin, and words polished the mind, where the scent of crushed leaves lingered in the air, and philosophy walked hand in hand with leisure, where a citizen could be whole, not just clean, but calm, not just rested, but reminded. And as the soft rustle of scrolls faded, and the garden's quiet offered its final moment of reflection, the visitor might once more step out into the open courtyards of the bathhouse, where the air was laced not with the scent of herbs or parchment, but with something far more primal and familiar, the warm, inviting aroma of food. Just as the mind could not remain cloistered in contemplation forever, neither could the body ignore the soft, persistent tug of hunger, which inevitably followed the sweating, the soaking, and the slow rhythm of leisure. In the outer porticos and the shaded exedrae, where the foot traffic of bathers swelled and thinned like a tide, vendors had long ago claimed their rightful place, and the experience of the Roman Thermae found one of its most sensory expressions, not in steam or silence, but in the shared pleasure of nourishment. The food was simple by some measures, yet deeply Roman in its practicality and poetry. A slave boy, his tunic hitched above his knees, might carry a shallow tray of warm flatbread dusted with coarse salt, the edges curled just enough to hold a smear of soft cheese or a spoonful of crushed olives. An older vendor, his hands as creased as the dates he sold, might pause beneath a statue's shade, offering dark fruit stuffed with nuts or drizzled with honey, until it glistened in the afternoon light. A jug of watered wine, for only a barbarian would drink it pure, stood beside a bowl of fresh herbs, ready to flavor each cup with the gentle bitterness of mint or the sharp lift of thyme. These vendors did not bark or shout, There was no frantic comment. Instead, they moved slowly among the marble benches and clusters of bathers, their offerings familiar, their presence accepted. Payment was often made with a nod, a coin passed casually from palm to palm, or in the case of wealthier patrons deferred entirely, handled later by a slave or steward. But it was the food itself that held the attention. Figs so ripe they split open at the top, releasing their sugar in tiny amber rivers down fingers and forearms. Slices of hard cheese paired with crusty bread, their textures playing against one another with each deliberate bite. Small bowls of olives soaked in oil, plucked and eaten one by one, their pits dropped onto stone with a soft clatter. Some bathers reclined beneath awnings, their bodies cooled by recent plunges, their mouths still warm from the salty sweetness of cured meats or honeyed nuts. Others sat upright in small groups, eating in between conversations about politics or poetry. It was a kind of ritual, unspoken but universally observed, a slowing down of time, a savouring of not just taste but of atmosphere. For food at the baths was not hurried, it was not hidden in private corners or devoured on the run. It was woven into the rhythm of the experience, just as surely as the baths themselves. And just as some had entered the libraries seeking wisdom, others now lingered near food stalls in search of stories. The vendors were not only merchants, they were conduits of rumour, news, local gossip, a new edict from the Senate, a scandal in a noble house, a soldier returned from Parthia with tales of strange customs and harsher wines, overshared bites of roasted chickpeas or fresh apple slices. Strangers became acquaintances, and acquaintances fell into easy banter. It was a communal kind of eating, where the barriers of class, though never fully dissolved, softened just enough for dialogue to flow. Of course not all indulged with the same abandon. Stoics might sip only water, their meals taken in modest bites, more discipline than pleasure. Gladiators, mindful of training regimens, chose dates and nuts over wine and cheese. Philosophers debated the ethics of gluttony while chewing dried apricots. But even restraint had its ritual here, and those who abstained did so not from haste but from principle. They too joined in the rhythm, sitting, talking, watching as food passed from hand to hand, and as laughter mingled with the sound of fountains and footsteps. Some bathhouses, particularly the grander ones in Rome, even offered designated dining areas, open-air triclinium spaces, where patrons reclined on stone couches arranged around low tables. These settings mimicked the traditional Roman banquet, but on a smaller, more casual scale. Instead of elaborate courses, there were platters of cold meats, bowls of lentils with coriander, baskets of warm rolls wrapped in linen, and always the hum of conversation, never boisterous, always restrained, filling the air like the low murmur of a stream. It was during these moments of figs shared, of wine sipped slowly, that the bathhouse revealed its final, most subtle function. It fed the soul not through abstraction or purity, but through indulgence balanced by ease. A bite of cheese, a glance at the sunlit sky, a philosophical phrase passed between sips. This was not merely a place to clean oneself, or even to think, but to live in a kind of harmony that few other settings allow. Clean skin, a quiet mind, a satisfied stomach, the trifecta of Roman contentment, achieved not in grand halls or distant villas, but here among steam and stone. As twilight began its slow descent and the marble took on cooler hues, the food vendors would begin to pack their wares, wiping honey from boards, stacking empty bowls, pouring the last of the diluted wine into amphorae for tomorrow. But the taste lingered, the scent of bread, the feel of figs between thumb and forefinger, the softness of cheese spread across a crust. All of it remained as part of the memory, as much a part of the bathhouse as the water itself. For what good was cleanliness if not followed by comfort? What use was reflection without replenishment? And so, with body bathed, mind nourished and appetite sated, the Roman bather stood poised at the final threshold of the day's experience, a space where all pleasures had been touched, and where the slow, dignified rhythm of leisure offered its final notes before the return to the noise of the street. And so, as the soft traces of food still danced on the tongue and the body basked in the quiet afterglow of warmth and fullness, the bather moved once again through the silent geometry of the Thermae. not as a mere visitor, but as a participant in a finely tuned social dance. The Roman bathhouse, for all its openness and sensory abundance, was never a space of unchecked freedom. Beneath its marble grandeur and laughter-laced gardens lay a quiet structure of expectations, a shared choreography of movement and manner that held the sprawling complex together. Without such rules, the harmony would collapse. Without etiquette, even the cleanest water would turn murky. The codes of the bathhouse were not posted on signs or proclaimed by heralds. They lived in gestures, in rhythms learned by observation, in glances exchanged between regulars. When someone stepped out of line, a newcomer could feel these rules before understanding them. In the subtle hush that followed a raised voice, in the sidelong look that met an accidental splash, in the stillness that surrounded a violation of shared space, the rules were lived, not written, and they bound patrician and plebeian alike with equal force. Perhaps the most immediately visible rule was simple: no running. The stone floors, worn smooth by years of bare feet and bathwater, turned treacherous when wet. Slipping was not just dangerous, it was undignified. Movement through the baths was to be measured, deliberate, a pace that mirrored the reflective mood of the space itself. Children, allowed only at certain hours or in designated areas, were carefully watched, their play subdued. Laughter was welcome, disorder was not. Another expectation governed how one moved through the bathing process. There was a natural order, from undressing in the apodicterium, to warming in the tepidarium, to sweating in the coldarium, and finally cooling in the frigidarium. Jumping ahead, skipping a chamber, or lingering too long in one, could disrupt the flow for others. In some larger baths, attendants guided patrons gently but firmly, ensuring that the unspoken progression remained intact. Even time had its etiquette here, and though the bathhouse invited conversation, even debate, even flirtation, there were boundaries. Lewdness, groping, or open displays of lust were discouraged, and in some cases, punished. The baths were sensual spaces, yes, but not decadent ones. A man who lingered too long beside another, or whose gaze wandered too freely, might find himself subtly shunned. A woman who laughed too loudly, or whose servant's hands strayed too low during an oiling, could be the subject of whispered reproach. Decorum was expected, and anything that broke the calm in voice, gesture, or presence was quietly rejected by the group. The apodicterium, the changing room, required its own special awareness. Here, where garments were folded and left on shelves or in niches, theft was not uncommon. A fine toga, a silver brooch, even a well-made sandal, could vanish in the short time it took to soak. As a result, many bathers brought slaves whose sole task was to sit beside the clothes, watchful and still. In some cities, the risk was high enough that certain guards, trained, discreet, were employed by the bathhouse itself. Yet even with these precautions, the unspoken rule persisted: do not touch what is not yours. To violate it was to brand oneself not just a thief, but a breaker of social trust, a shadow among the clean. And there were subtler rules still. Where one sat mattered. How close one soaked beside another was governed by proximity, familiarity, and social standing. A senator did not wedge himself beside a baker. A wealthy widow did not sprawl where freedmen gathered. Yet these boundaries too were flexible, softened by the very nature of the space. A good joke, a shared loaf, a thoughtful comment on philosophy could bridge gaps that outside the walls would never be crossed. But always, the manner of approach had to be correct, respectful, humble, never assuming equality where none had been offered. Even silence had its place. In the libraries, quiet was expected, but even in the steam rooms or the cooling pools, there were moments when stillness was observed. A long pause between conversations, a communal sigh in the hot air, a recognition that speech, though welcome, was not always necessary. To talk too much, too loudly, or without pause was to disturb not just others, but the spirit of the place itself. A man might enter with problems, with grief, with anger, but once inside he was expected to carry those burdens lightly or not at all. The bathhouse then was a paradox, open to all, yet governed by rules invisible to the untrained eye, a place of indulgence, yet one that demanded restraint. It welcomed the body, yes, but insisted on a kind of mental grace, a dance of courtesy, a mosaic of manner, and those who could not learn it, who insulted slaves or splashed others, or interrupted with loud complaints, found themselves gently exiled, not by decree but by disinterest. Doors might remain open, but invitations did not. So the bather, whether a seasoned noble or a newly arrived provincial, quickly learned the steps: when to soak, where to walk, how to sit, who to address, when to laugh, all of it a language without words spoken through posture and presence. And though few would speak of it aloud, this code of behavior, this delicate scaffolding of politeness, was what made the bathhouse more than stone and water. It made it Rome. And now, as the final pools beckoned, and the sun fell lower over tiled rooftops, the last step in the ritual awaited, a moment of stillness, then departure. Yet even in leaving, one was bound by the same quiet dignity. No loud farewells, no boast, just a final glance, a nod to the attendant, and the slow, measured steps back into the dust and clamour of the city. Time, which had once seemed to pause at the threshold of the Thermae, now moved relentlessly through its halls. The steam that once rose like breath from the city's stone lungs began to thin, its warmth no longer eternal, its rhythm no longer assured. Where once there had been laughter echoing off marble domes and scholars disputing softly in shaded corners, now came only silence, slow, creeping, and absolute. The decline did not arrive all at once, but it was relentless, like moss finding the cracks in forgotten fountains. The mighty Roman baths, once the proud jewel of civic life, began to surrender, not in rebellion, but in resignation. It began in the places least noticed, a flickering torch not replaced, a dripping pipe allowed to rot, a drain choked with hair and oil, left for tomorrow. And then tomorrow never came. The caldarium's fire, once fed dutifully by slaves trained in the art of heat, began to burn low, sputtering in its stone furnace. Without constant attention, the hypocaust cooled, the tepidarium went cold, the frigidarium became a place of shiver, not refreshment. Patrons wrapped themselves in towels and glanced around with quiet unease, wondering what had changed, and whether it would return. But it did not. The coins that once paid for upkeep were now spent on armies. The workers who once scoured mosaics clean of grime now fought on distant borders, or vanished with their tools into the countryside. Civic pride, once the lifeblood of the Thermae, was traded for survival. And above all there rose a whisper, a murmur from new voices in the streets, in the basilicas, in the shadows of the temples. Christianity ascendant viewed the public baths with suspicion. The naked body, once celebrated in polished marble and soothed in oil and steam, was now a source of shame. Pleasure was no longer seen as virtue. Indulgence became sin. A culture of cleanliness gave way to one of abstinence. Some bathhouses closed gradually, their crowds thinning until only a handful of old men returned, out of habit more than hope. Others fell swiftly, their roofs collapsing in a single night of storm, their pipes freezing and bursting when no one remained to tend the flames. Vandals and Visigoths looted what the city could no longer defend. Lead piping was melted down for weapons. Bronze statues vanished from niches. Lions carved into fountains wore blind, eroded faces. Marble cracked, then crumbled. Rain ran unchecked down mosaic walls. Birds nested where senators once bathed. Nature crept in slowly, respectfully at first. Weeds between paving stones, ivy climbing the columns, then with boldness, trees sprouting in the open-air palastrae, root-splitting cisterns once carefully balanced. The groves outside grew thick and reclaimed the shaded gardens. Bees hummed where once orators spoke. Lizards sunned themselves on crumbling benches. The baths did not rage against the dying of their fires, they simply ceased. For a time, ghosts lingered, not of people, but of routine. A pair of sandals forgotten in a corner, a child's wooden doll beneath a bench, a rusty strigil buried beneath the dust. But eventually, even memory faded. The bathhouses became curiosities to passing travelers, then ruins to be plundered, then hills to be built over. In some places, the very outlines of the Thermae were swallowed by centuries. The silence was not sudden. It arrived like sleep, slow, enveloping, dreamless. And yet, there are places still, where the bones of these great structures remain. The arches, half standing, cast shadows in the late sun. The steps leading to empty pools are worn down by long-forgotten feet. A column reaches skyward, not in pride, but in remembrance. Scholars may study them. Tourists may tread where emperors once soaked. But the soul of the baths, the heat, the murmur, the rising steam, the laughter and sweat of the city at ease, is gone. It died not with violence, but with neglect, not with fire, but with forgetfulness. The Roman bathhouse, once a miracle of order and indulgence, dissolved like mist into the cold morning of a new age. And so, where once the city gathered daily to shed its burdens, now only wind walks the empty halls, and silence, heavy, solemn, endless, settles where steam once sank. Even now, as centuries lie layered like sediment upon the bones of the old empire, the Roman bathhouse endures, not in its function, but in its form, in its memory, in the way sun strikes broken marble, and wind sighs through archways built for voices long gone. The pools are dry, the mosaics are fractured, columns lean, softened by time and rain and the touch of hands that have not existed for 1,000 years. And yet, somehow the Thermae remain, not only as crumbling architecture, but as living echoes etched deep into stone, into soil, into the cultural memory of civilization itself. There is a stillness now in those ruins, but it is not entirely empty. A silence, yes, but not void. It holds weight like breath held before speech. For every collapsed dome and shattered vault, there is a trace of life that lingers. Here, a niche where oil flasks once hung. There, a bench where friends rested, dripping from the frigidarium. These stones remember. They remember the laughter of boys chasing each other through clouds of steam, the soft muttering of scholars in shaded porticos, the scrape of a strigil across tired skin, the splash of water, the hum of voices, the hiss of flame beneath the floor. Each echo is faint, but if one stands quietly enough, not just with ears but with spirit, one may feel them still, whispering across the centuries. Tourists come now, their footsteps careful, hushed. They tilt their heads and squint at Latin inscriptions, trace the edges of cracked pools with idle fingers, snap photographs of pillars that once framed the very center of daily Roman life. Most will leave with curiosities, a postcard, a guidebook, a passing sense of marvel. But a few, the ones who listen with patience, who wait as the light shifts across ancient stone, may sense something deeper, not just ruins but ritual, not just engineering, but emotion. They may feel for a flickering moment what it meant to be Roman, to gather in heat and water, to cleanse body and mind, to be part of something enduring and shared. The bathhouse was never merely about hygiene. It was communion, with the self, with the city, with the gods and with one another. In the steamy embrace of the caldarium, class distinctions dissolved. A senator and a cobbler sweated side by side. Beneath the open sky of the palastra, friendships were forged in the dust of the training yard. The Thermae were Rome distilled, orderly, indulgent, functional, theatrical, grand, and now, in their faded glory, they remain a mirror of that once mighty soul, fractured but enduring, quiet but powerful, forgotten by some, but never truly lost. Even the word bath, simple, familiar, carries within it echoes of this ancient ritual. Spa towns across Europe trace their origins to Roman springs. Modern saunas, steam rooms, massage tables, gymnasiums, all carry the faint perfume of oil and myrrh, the DNA of the Thermae. The rhythms of cleansing, of communal relaxation, of bodily renewal, They continue though stripped of marble and stripped of myth. And so the story ends not with collapse, but with remembrance. The marble is cold now, but it once knew warmth. The pools are empty, but they once reflected face. The halls are silent, but they once sang with the ordinary music of Roman life. And perhaps that is what makes the bathhouse eternal. Not its stones but its spirit, not the structure, but the sensation. That feeling of shedding dust and sweat, of sinking into warmth, of letting the weight of the day dissolve, not just from the skin but from the soul. The Roman bathhouse then is not truly gone. It survives in echoes, in architecture, in language, in the way we still seek comfort in heat, in water, in togetherness. It lingers in the quiet pause before entering a warm room, in the hush of steam, in the tiled floor beneath bare feet. In memory it lives, tiled not just in stone, but in ritual, in warmth, in the unbroken rhythm of shared humanity. And as long as we seek stillness, renewal, and peace in the simplest acts of water and warmth, the Thermae and Rome will never fully